The sound of the hospital machines hummed in the background, a steady rhythm that seemed to echo louder in the silence of the room. James lay unconscious, his life hanging by the thinnest of threads, the once strong man now reduced to nothing more than a fragile body, tubes and wires tethering him to this world. His fiancée, Sarah, stood at the foot of the bed, her face pale, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the hospital counter. She was alone. Or so she thought. From behind the corner of the hallway, unseen and unnoticed, Mark listened in on the conversation that would change everything. The words he overheard, the words he could hardly believe, felt like a slap to the face. "Isn't it time?" Sarah's voice was quiet, barely a whisper, but it carried with it a weight that sank straight into Mark's chest. The silence in the hospital seemed to stretch on forever as Sarah stared at James. Her once loving gaze was cold now, her fingers brushing over his lifeless hand with an unsettling detachment. "You said it yourself, there's no hope for him," Sarah continued. "We've already tried everything. I can't keep doing this. I can't keep living like this." Mark's heart raced as he stepped back, pressing his back against the wall. He couldn't breathe. He had to be hearing things, right? This couldn't be real. The woman he thought he knew, the woman he had considered a friend for years, was planning to pull the plug on her fiancé? But that wasn't all. No. The worst part of it all, the thing that left him reeling, was what she said next. "I know what I have to do now. I'll make it look like an accident, no one will ever know the truth." The world around Mark spun, the reality of the situation crashing over him in waves. His hands felt clammy, his thoughts scattered. He had never suspected Sarah to be capable of something so cold, so calculated. But there it was. An undeniable plan to end James's life, and worse yet, to cover it up. His mind raced. Why would she do this? What could possibly be driving her to such an extreme? And what could he do about it? He couldn't just let her go through with it. He couldn't let James die like this, not when there was a chance that the truth behind the situation could be something entirely different. But what if Sarah wasn't the only one hiding something? Mark quickly turned and hurried down the hallway, his thoughts chaotic and tangled. His heart pounded as he thought about what he had just heard. What was going on here? How could Sarah, who had seemed so loving, so devoted, be planning something so horrendous? He had to confront her. But how? Mark couldn't shake the chilling words Sarah had said. As the sound of the hospital's overhead lights buzzed above him, his mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. He hadn't meant to overhear the conversation, but now that he had, there was no going back. Every step he took seemed heavier than the last, and he found himself standing at the edge of something far darker than he could have imagined. Every moment felt like a ticking clock. He knew they were getting closer to the truth, but it seemed as though the closer they got, the more dangerous the situation became. Sarah wasn't the same woman he had once known. She was a stranger now, someone willing to sacrifice everything, including the person she supposedly loved, to get what she wanted. The life insurance policy. The offshore accounts. The conversations she had been having in secret. Everything pointed toward one terrifying truth: Sarah had been plotting James's death for far longer than anyone realized. And now, they were running out of time. Mark had spent hours going over everything they had learned so far, piecing together the puzzle. He had spoken to Detective Lawson earlier that day, and they had uncovered even more unsettling details. Sarah's financial activity was suspicious, to say the least. The money she had been transferring into offshore accounts wasn't just for some random investment, it was part of a larger plan. But what was her ultimate goal? Maybe it's just greed, Tom had suggested earlier, as they sat in a dimly lit cafe, the noise of the bustling street outside muffling their conversation. Maybe she's after the money, pure and simple. Mark had considered this, but something didn't sit right. It wasn't just the money. Sarah had gone to extreme lengths to make sure everything was set up perfectly. She had orchestrated James's accident with chilling precision, but it was more than that. This wasn't just a financial scheme. There was something deeper, something more personal, that was driving her. Mark knew he had to find out what that was. The next morning, Mark and Tom returned to the hospital, this time more determined than ever. They had to dig deeper. Sarah had become more desperate with each passing day, and Mark knew that she wouldn't just sit back and let them uncover her secrets. She had to be stopped before it was too late. "Stay focused," Tom said as they walked through the sterile corridors of the hospital. "We can't let our emotions get in the way. We need to gather evidence, not just confront her." Mark nodded, though the weight of the situation was almost suffocating. He couldn't shake the image of Sarah's face when she had told them to get out of James's room. There was something in her eyes, something wild, almost frantic, that made his stomach turn. She was cornered, and cornered animals were the most dangerous. As they reached James's room, Mark felt a pang of guilt. He had known James for years, he had been there for him through thick and thin. And now, because of Sarah's betrayal, James was fighting for his life, unable to defend himself. Mark had promised himself that he would do whatever it took to save him. But in order to save him, he had to expose the truth. The door to James's room was slightly ajar, and Mark pushed it open cautiously. Inside, Sarah was sitting in the same spot by James's bedside, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen from crying. Her behavior was almost too perfect, too rehearsed. It was as if she was trying to convince herself that everything was fine, trying to convince herself that she wasn't guilty of the terrible thing she had done. Mark took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. They couldn't let her manipulate them. They needed to stay one step ahead. "We need to talk," Mark said, his voice calm but firm. Sarah looked up, her expression shifting from one of grief to one of guarded suspicion. "What is it now?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "We know what you've been doing," Tom said, stepping forward. "We know about the life insurance. We know about the offshore accounts. And we know that you've been planning this for months." Sarah's eyes widened, and for the briefest moment, she seemed to lose control of her emotions. The facade cracked, and Mark saw the fear, the panic, that had been lurking beneath the surface. But it was only for a moment. She quickly recovered, her face hardening once again. "You don't know anything," Sarah spat. "You think you have all the answers, but you have no idea what you're talking about." Mark's heart raced. He could see the walls she had built around herself beginning to crumble, but he needed to press harder. "We know about the money, Sarah. We know what you've been planning for James. And we know that you don't care about him anymore. You only care about the money." Her jaw clenched, but she said nothing. The silence in the room was suffocating. Mark could feel the weight of the truth hanging in the air, waiting to be exposed. "You don't understand," Sarah finally said, her voice quieter now. "You don't know what it's like, to be trapped. To feel like there's no way out." Mark stepped closer, his voice low but steady. "You had a choice, Sarah. You could have walked away. You didn't have to do this." Her eyes flashed with something that Mark couldn't quite place, anger, resentment, maybe even regret. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. Sarah stood up abruptly, her hands trembling at her sides. "You don't get it," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "James was never the man I thought he was. He was weak. He couldn't provide for me. He couldn't give me what I needed. And when I found someone who could, someone who promised to take care of me, what was I supposed to do?" Mark's stomach turned as the pieces of Sarah's twisted logic fell into place. She had used James. She had manipulated him into thinking that everything was fine, that they were happy, when in reality, she had been planning his death all along. But it wasn't just for the money, it was for herself. She had chosen the life she wanted, and James had become nothing more than a roadblock in her way. You really thought you could get away with it? Tom asked, his voice laced with disbelief. You thought no one would notice? Sarah laughed, but it wasn't the laugh of someone who was amused. It was bitter, almost hysterical. I didn't think I'd get away with it forever. But I thought I'd have more time. Time to get everything in place, time to make sure no one could stop me. Mark's mind raced. There had to be more to this, more that they didn't know yet. But before he could ask another question, Sarah stepped toward the door, her face hardening once more. You don't know what I've been through, she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fury and desperation. You think you can just come in here and take everything away from me? You think you can just expose me and ruin my life? You don't understand how far I'm willing to go to protect what's mine. With that, she pushed past them, the door slamming shut behind her with a finality that sent chills down Mark's spine. Mark and Tom stood there in silence, the gravity of Sarah's confession hanging in the air. They had been right all along. Sarah wasn't just after the money. She had been planning to leave James behind, to walk away from everything she had once pretended to care about, all for her own selfish desires. But Mark wasn't going to let her win. Not now. Not when they were so close to exposing the truth. He turned to Tom, his eyes hard with determination. We need to find the smoking gun. We need to finish this before it's too late. They knew what had to be done. But they also knew that their next move was dangerous. Sarah was already desperate. And desperate people didn't hesitate. If they weren't careful, they could lose everything. But they couldn't stop now. They had to keep pushing forward. For James. For the truth. And for justice. The air felt thick with the weight of everything that had happened. Every step Mark took in the sterile hospital halls felt like one closer to the edge, one closer to the truth, no matter how dark and terrifying it might be. The closer they got to Sarah, the more unstable the ground beneath their feet became. Mark could feel it in the pit of his stomach, a gnawing sensation telling him that they were standing on the precipice of something unimaginable. Sarah's last words echoed in his mind. You don't know what I've been through. You think you can just expose me and ruin my life? You don't understand how far I'm willing to go to protect what's mine. Mark wasn't sure what terrified him more, the chilling certainty in her voice or the fact that, deep down, he knew she wasn't bluffing. She would do anything to keep her secrets hidden, and now that they were so close, she would stop at nothing to protect herself. The detective had promised to help them dig deeper, but Mark knew time was running out. They had to act quickly, or they might lose their chance to expose Sarah's web of lies. And the more they uncovered, the more it became clear that this wasn't just about money. It was about power. Control. And betrayal on a level they hadn't anticipated. Mark, you good? Tom asked, pulling him out of his thoughts as they sat in the small cafe across the street from the hospital. I'm fine, Mark replied, though his voice was strained. But we need to move faster. Sarah knows we're onto her. She's starting to crack, and I don't know how much longer she'll hold it together. Tom nodded, his face grim. We've been trying to gather evidence from every angle, but it's still like we're chasing shadows. There's got to be something else, something we haven't thought of yet. Mark's mind raced. What were they missing? They had the insurance policy, the offshore accounts, Sarah's behavior, and her cryptic confession. They knew she had been planning this for months, but there was something off about it all. Something that didn't add up. I think we need to get inside her head, Mark said suddenly, his voice sharp with realization. We need to understand why she did this. If we can figure out what drove her to this point, maybe we can get the leverage we need. Tom stared at him, his brow furrowed. Are you saying we should talk to her again? Mark nodded. Not directly. But we need to go deeper. We need to find out who else she's been talking to. Who else might be involved in all this? Tom's eyes narrowed. You're talking about the people she's been working with behind the scenes. The ones pulling the strings. Mark exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Exactly. There's no way she could have pulled this off on her own. She's been too careful. Too deliberate. Someone else is helping her. And if we find that person, we can take her down, Tom finished for him. Mark met his friend's gaze, both of them understanding the gravity of what they were about to do. It wasn't just about exposing Sarah anymore, it was about bringing down the entire operation. If they were right, Sarah was part of something far bigger than they had imagined, and it could be more dangerous than either of them realized. The breakthrough. The next morning, Mark and Tom arrived at the police station to meet Detective Lawson. Mark could see the exhaustion in the detective's face, but there was also a flicker of determination in his eyes. They were close. Mark could feel it in his bones. I've been looking into Sarah's background, Detective Lawson said, standing up from his desk as they entered his office. I've found something interesting. Mark and Tom exchanged a look. What is it? Mark asked, leaning forward. It's about the offshore accounts, Lawson said, pulling up a series of documents on his computer. There's more than one account. And they're connected to a larger network of people. I've traced some of the transactions, and it leads to a name, someone who's been involved in financial schemes for years. I think Sarah's been working with them. Mark felt his pulse quicken. Who is it? The detective hesitated before answering. A man named Thomas Green. He's a financial consultant with a history of running illegal operations. Money laundering, fraud, you name it. He's been operating under the radar for years, and I think he's the one who's been helping Sarah cover her tracks. Tom looked at Mark, his eyes wide with realization. That's it. Green's the key. Mark nodded, feeling a surge of adrenaline. They finally had a name. Thomas Green was the missing link they had been searching for. And if they could tie him to Sarah's plan, they would have the smoking gun they needed to bring her down. Where do we find him? Mark asked, his voice steady despite the rush of emotions he felt. I've already contacted a few sources, Detective Lawson said. Green's been moving around a lot lately, but I think he's hiding out in a remote cabin upstate. We're planning a raid soon. But if you're in, I'll need you to stay focused. This guy is dangerous. Mark didn't hesitate. We're in. We need to finish this. The raid. The drive upstate was long and tense. Mark's mind kept replaying the pieces of the puzzle: Sarah, Green, the offshore accounts, the life insurance policy. He couldn't help but wonder how far this web stretched. How many people were involved in this twisted scheme? And what would happen if they didn't get to Green before he disappeared? As they pulled into a small, desolate town, Mark felt a deep sense of foreboding settle over him. The cabin was just ahead, nestled in the woods. The entire area was quiet, too quiet. There were no cars, no signs of life, just the rustling of leaves in the wind and the distant sound of water flowing. They parked the car a distance away from the cabin and approached cautiously, staying low and silent. Detective Lawson led the way, his hand on his weapon, his face set in grim determination. Mark and Tom followed close behind, their hearts pounding in their chests. As they neared the cabin, the tension became almost unbearable. Mark's senses were heightened, every little sound seeming amplified in the silence. The door to the cabin was slightly ajar, and Mark could see movement inside. He gestured for Tom to stay behind, and he moved forward quietly, his mind racing. He peered around the corner of the cabin and caught sight of Thomas Green. The man was sitting at a table, his back turned. But it wasn't the man himself that caught Mark's attention, it was the stack of papers in front of him. Green was looking over financial documents that Mark instantly recognized as the ones Sarah had signed. The life insurance policy. The offshore accounts. The evidence they needed. Mark's pulse quickened. They had him. But before he could move in, a gunshot rang out. The world seemed to slow down for Mark as the sound of the gunshot echoed through the trees. It was as if time itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. For a moment, all he could hear was the pounding of his heart in his ears and the rush of adrenaline coursing through his veins. He felt like he was in a dream, one that was both too surreal to be true and yet too terrifying to ignore. It was too late to turn back now. Mark's instinct was to duck, to get cover, but the moment passed as quickly as it came. Another shot rang out, louder this time. He instinctively looked back, meeting Detective Lawson's eyes. The detective's expression was grim, his hand still on his weapon. He signaled for Mark to stay low. Tom, who had been creeping up beside Mark, was now frozen in place. His eyes darted between the cabin and the surrounding trees. The danger was palpable, like the air before a storm. Mark motioned for Tom to follow, his gut telling him they were close, too close to give up now. The raid had escalated faster than they could have prepared for. Thomas Green had known they were coming, and now everything had become a race. They weren't just chasing down a man, they were fighting for their lives. The documents they had found in the cabin were the final piece of the puzzle, the last bit of evidence that would expose Sarah and her partner's scheme. Green, however, wasn't about to go down easily. Mark, with his gun drawn, inched forward, inching closer to the cabin. His eyes locked on the figure through the crack in the door. The figure shifted, making a low sound. Green. He was looking over the papers in front of him, papers that could destroy everything. Mark had no doubt that the man was the mastermind behind everything, the dark shadow pulling the strings of Sarah's betrayal. The same man who had been helping Sarah for months. A cold, calculating figure who would stop at nothing to protect himself. But the real question was, what was Green willing to do to keep this secret? Mark knew they were moments away from a dangerous standoff. He and Tom exchanged glances, the tension thick between them. It was do or die now. If they could take Green down, they would expose Sarah for everything she was, a woman consumed by greed and willing to destroy anyone who got in her way. The standoff. Mark was close now, just a few steps away from the cabin. He could see Green's figure more clearly. The man was sitting at the table, shuffling through papers as if the weight of his criminal empire was nothing more than a nuisance to him. His cold eyes were locked on the documents, but there was a sense of unease in his posture, like he knew something was about to happen, but wasn't sure when. Mark gestured for Tom to take the left side of the cabin, his voice a whisper. "We move in now. Don't give him a chance to escape." Tom nodded silently, slipping behind the side of the cabin. With a deep breath, Mark kicked the door open, the sound of it slamming against the wood almost deafening. "Freeze!" Green looked up in surprise, his eyes widening as they locked on Mark. His hand darted toward the gun at his waist, but Mark was faster. In a single fluid motion, Mark aimed his weapon at Green's chest, holding him in place. "I said freeze." Mark repeated, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. The power of the situation was clear now. They were in control. Green didn't move, but his lips curled into a twisted smile. "You think you've won?" he asked, his voice calm despite the situation. "You think this is going to end like you think it will?" Mark narrowed his eyes. There was something about Green's demeanor, his cocky, almost smug attitude, that unnerved him. He was trying to intimidate them, trying to get inside their heads. "It's over," Mark said, his voice unwavering. "You and Sarah have been running a scam for months, and it ends now." Green laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," he said, shaking his head. "You think this is about money? You think you understand what's really going on here?" Mark wasn't sure if he was more disgusted or confused by Green's words. What was he trying to say? Before Mark could respond, Green stood up suddenly, his hand reaching for something hidden under the table. But Mark was already one step ahead. He moved quickly, knocking Green's hand away and twisting his arm behind his back, forcing him to the ground. "Don't even think about it," Mark growled. Green struggled briefly, but the weight of Mark's hold on him made it impossible to break free. His breathing became ragged as he realized the futility of his resistance. "You think you can take me down?" Green spat. "You don't understand. You never understood. Sarah was just a pawn in a bigger game. And you're just a piece too." Mark's heart skipped a beat as Green's words sunk in. A bigger game? What did that mean? It was clear Green was hiding something bigger than just a financial scam. And Mark wasn't about to let him off the hook without getting the answers they needed. "Start talking," Mark demanded. "What do you mean by that? What's going on here?" Green's smile faded as his eyes darted around the cabin. "You've got no idea who you're dealing with, do you? This isn't about money, or Sarah, or even me. It's about power. It's about control. And you've just walked right into the middle of it. The shocking truth." Mark's mind raced as Green's words hung in the air. Power? Control? What was he talking about? Before Mark could ask another question, the cabin door slammed open, and a figure appeared in the doorway. "Mark! Get down!" It was Tom, his face pale with fear. Mark didn't need to ask why. The look in Tom's eyes was enough to tell him something had gone terribly wrong. And then it hit him. The sound of sirens, growing louder with each passing second, filled the air. "It's a trap," Green muttered, his grin returning as he looked at Mark with something almost akin to amusement. "You're too late. They're already here." Mark's blood ran cold as the reality set in. The sirens weren't just a coincidence. They were a sign that Green's entire operation was much bigger than anything they had imagined. They had walked right into a carefully laid trap. Before Mark could react, the sound of heavy boots echoed from behind him. He turned just in time to see multiple figures, armed men, charging toward them. They were here. And they weren't just here to arrest anyone. They were here to kill. The escape. The next few moments were chaos. Mark and Tom barely had time to react as the armed men closed in, their guns trained on them. Mark grabbed Green by the collar, pulling him toward the door as shots rang out behind him. The cabin exploded in a flurry of movement, and Mark could feel the heat of the bullets whizzing past him. "Move!" Tom shouted, pulling Mark toward the side of the cabin, but it was clear they weren't going to make it out without a fight. As they raced for cover, Mark's mind was whirling. How had they been caught so completely off guard? Who were these men? And what did Green mean about power and control? They didn't have time to think. All Mark knew was that they had to survive. They had to get out, and they had to take Green down before it was too late. The sirens grew louder as reinforcements arrived, but Mark had a plan, one last chance to end this. He could only hope they weren't too late. The final lesson. Hours later, the police had secured the cabin. Green was arrested, and the full extent of his involvement in the criminal network was uncovered. It was bigger than anyone had imagined, an international operation dealing with illegal financial schemes, money laundering, and even human trafficking. Green wasn't just a financial consultant, he was a key player in a global network that spanned multiple countries. As for Sarah, her role in the operation was exposed. She had been in deep with Green, using James's life insurance policy and offshore accounts to launder money, but that was just the beginning. Her betrayal of James wasn't just about greed, it was about power. Power she thought she could control. But in the end, it consumed her. Mark and Tom stood outside the cabin, watching as the police worked to take everything down. The full extent of Sarah's betrayal had been revealed, and it was a harsh reminder of just how far people could go when they let their ambitions cloud their morality. As they walked away from the scene, Mark couldn't help but think of the lesson this whole ordeal had taught him: never underestimate the length someone will go to for power and control. And never forget that sometimes, the hardest part of survival is knowing when to let go of the lies, and face the truth. And with that, the investigation was over. But the scars, both emotional and physical, would stay with Mark forever.